Hello, and welcome once again to the Millennial Moron Podcast. Longtime viewers may remember that last year I did a series of videos on the affordable housing plan in Calgary, Alberta. While their city council ended up voting in favor of the plan, that vote was just to direct city administration to come up with a plan for implementation, and now in 2024, many of the individual items in the plan will be voted on again. One of the most contentious items is changing the base residential zone in the city to RCG, or Residential Contextual Ground Oriented. This would allow multiplexes and row housing to be built anywhere in the city by default rather than requiring an upzoning process for each individual parcel. Today's discussion focuses on this change, what the potential benefits are, and addressing some of the concerns that are frequently expressed about broad-based upzoning. Joining me for the discussion are Courtney Walcott, Calgary City Councillor for Ward 8, Josh White, Director of City and Regional Planning for the City of Calgary, and Kathryn Davies, co-founder of More Neighbours Calgary, an affordable housing advocacy group. Without further ado, please enjoy today's podcast featuring myself and three actual grown-ups. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Millennial Moron Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Calgary's affordable housing plan and the possibility of citywide upzoning to RCG. I've got a very exciting panel of guests today, so let's start off by going around and explaining who you are and why housing is an important issue to you. Councillor Walcott, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. I'm Councillor Walcott, Councillor Courtney Walcott. I'm one of the city councillors here in Calgary. My area is Ward 8. And so for anyone who doesn't know what Ward 8 is, the way that I've always described it is it's from the Beltline up to Mount Royal University and then from the river to Ross Carrick. One of the reasons why housing is so important to me is, of course, just my own personal experience with it. I've always known that my ability to succeed has actually been tied to the fact that I had a lot of base level supports, including growing up in affordable housing. But above and beyond that, where this space actually got really interesting is my background in anti-racism work and how housing actually became one of the places where a lot of historical discrimination happened, which resulted in a lot of different people being unable to access a market that gave them safe, accessible, and secure housing. And then the end result was years and years of economic disparities. And so when I ran for council, as part of that work, was about correcting some of those historical disparities.
I'm Josh White. I'm currently the Director of City and Regional Planning at the City of Calgary. So we're the group responsible for our policy and regulatory environment in planning. And so I'm interested in housing because of the issue that confronts our city in terms of level of affordability and affordability eroding, but also the role and the part to play that the municipality could do, including and especially our policies and regulations and processes that can impact positively or negatively our housing situation.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Davies. I'm a volunteer and co-founder of More Neighbours Calgary. And I've always had an interest in cities and housing and urban planning, but it was when I became a community volunteer and I found out just how intense opposition is really to everything that comes up, that I thought we need to talk more about this, and we need to start speaking up in favor of housing all across the income spectrum everywhere in the city.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn, and I'm your host, Millennial Moron, a guy who likes to make videos about real estate from his mom's basement. I guess my interest in housing came from many years of watching real estate slowly consume the entire Canadian economy and shut a lot of people my age out of home ownership. But now with the rental market becoming extremely tight, it's getting a lot harder for people to find any kind of stable living situation at all, even if they're working full time. And, housing really is a fundamental necessity for everyone. And I think, honestly, we should be deeply embarrassed as a society that we've gotten to a point where it's getting harder and harder for people just to live indoors. And, for me, it's gotten past the point where I can just sit and say, I'm fine, so I don't have to worry about it. Now, before we really get into the subject, I think it's important to talk about this at the top of the show. But if people listening want to help push these affordable housing measures forward, what can normal people do to get involved in this process?
Yeah, so our city council here in Calgary passed a housing strategy last year, last fall, and it includes a number of actions. One of the actions we'll talk about today is creating a new base residential zoning for the city. So we're out there in the public right now, doing public engagement, gathering feedback, and preparing for a public hearing, which will happen at city council to decide on the citywide rezoning. And so a really important way to have impact and participate, if you care about this issue, is to show up, the public hearing, have your voice heard, to your democratically elected decision makers who are the ultimate decision makers for this proposal.
One of the spaces in which I think the everyday person can get involved is actually trying to figure out how to get involved about something you're passionate about long before these decisions as well. And so I'm gonna let Kathryn talk more about what it means to be a part of some of these organizations over the period of time between when these ideas are happening and being discussed at a community level to when they get to council. But one of the most important things is actually just not waiting until the crisis and just being a part of your community in a way that is accepting of change and is also encouraged to take a strong role in allowing your communities to change, matching the needs of society and the needs of the city as a whole. That's where some of the really powerful organizations, and one of which that Kathryn is the co-founder of, becomes really, really important. If you just believe in helping people live indoors, like you said, this is the place to do it. So
Yeah, I can add to that. So one of the reasons that I think More Neighbours was founded is that we've looked at cities like Vancouver and Toronto. So I have family in Vancouver that are priced out of the housing market. My husband is from Toronto, and he would love to move back to Toronto, and we can never do that. We can never afford to live in Toronto. And so we look around at our city, which has traditionally been affordable, and that's been one of its advantages. And we've been thinking, let's try to get ahead of this. Like, let's see if we can stave off this affordability catastrophe that other cities are facing. So we're looking at some very specific actions over the next several months, but we're also looking long-term at how can we make our city a great place for everyone, a city where everyone can live indoors. We're thinking long-term about our advocacy. If anyone listening to this does want to get involved, we'd love to have you at More Neighbours. Our website is moreneighbourscalgary.ca. We have a Discord server, and I have cared about these issues for a long time, but it's only in the past couple of years that I figured out that citizens' voices can make a difference. And I figured out how to navigate some of the bureaucracy at City Hall so that I could make my voice heard. And we're very keen on helping other people do that within their own communities and within the municipal government.
Okay, thank you. So to kick things off, I think the whole affordable housing plan is up for discussion today, but the main item we want to talk about is the proposal for citywide upzoning to RCG, which council is going to be voting on April 22nd. So what exactly is RCG, and what does it mean for the average person?
Yeah, I can explain what RCG is. It's a it's a type of zoning or land use district that already exists within the city of Calgary. So what RCG enables is both single detached housing, semi-detached like duplex style housing, side by side type housing, and also row and townhouse style development on lots. So currently our zoning, you have like RC1 or R1 zoning that's exclusively single detached. About 2/3 of our city has that zoning. There's parts of the inner city that have allowed duplexes for the last 40 years. But RCG was created in 2014 as a district, but so far, the only RCG that exists on the ground is through very select city-initiated rezonings on a couple corridors, or most of the row housing that has been built has been the result of a developer-initiated rezoning. And so, what this proposal does is to say RCG, which allows all those forms up to a maximum of row housing, should be the lowest based residential zoning so that you could enable more diversity of housing as a baseline across the entire city.
I think one of my favorite parts about this conversation is it's like you have to know the rules in full to be able to break it down into very simplistic language. And so for those of you who are listening, Josh has told you the rules. To be honest, whenever you're just having a conversation with the everyday person and you want to try and figure out how to describe to them what the RCG rezoning is, you tell them the simplest truth, which is you can have different types of housing, right? All of them will be roughly the same height and size. The only difference is some will be singles, some will be townhouses, some will be row houses, and now people can build them wherever they're appropriate, right? And that is like it's like period, right? That's all it really is. There's nothing complex. There's no secret to the RCG. It's just that right now the whole city, like above 60% of the city, you can only build the minimum, which is one. We just want to up the potential of every unit to be up to a row house, and that's it. Like a low-hanging fruit that I'd like to get behind us one day, so that we can look at the bigger affordable housing problems.
I can just add that it's one thing to explain RCG, it's one thing to read the policy, but I live in a neighborhood that went through a planning exercise around the same time that RCG was the district was approved. So I actually live in a neighborhood with quite a bit of RCG development. There was some city initiated rezoning within the last decade, and we've seen a number of projects. For the most part, they're really nice and they tend to be in row house form. So I know that RCG is more than row houses, but a lot of times in my neighborhood, we see them as row houses. And so I can actually point to examples of them. I walk past them every day. And I like them. I think they're quite nice. I live in a bungalow and we love our house, but it's a really bad use of this 50-foot lot, like this one little house. And I think that RCG housing is a lot more efficient. It's a much better use of our land. And come to my neighborhood if you want to take a look.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out like Calgary's pattern of development, and how row house forms end up showing up on the ground. We're even a large proportion of our inner city area, even within a couple kilometers of our downtown core, was developed post World War II. And the very typical lot pattern is a 50-foot wide bungalow form in its original subdivision, and about 120 feet deep. And so on a corner site, you end up seeing row housing that's usually 4 units above, and then in about half the cases, you're also getting secondary suites below. So you're getting up to 8 dwelling units, some very much at that middle density and middle price range, but also it's introducing, I think something that's lost in the discussion is through this type of redevelopment, you're also getting a lot of secondary suite redevelopment because it's really economical to build when you're building a new structure in a basement. So that either provides a mortgage helper for if it's owned outright upstairs, for it to rent out the basement, but is also producing rental stock, which we know secondary suites is sort of the lowest end of the rental stock market, the most affordable part of the rental stock market, and it's brand new, safe, very attractive, um, secondary rental market as well that RCG ends up adding, given how it ends up manifesting in Calgary's circumstance here based on our history and our lotting patterns.
Okay, so I think one sticking point for a lot of people is that when they see this kind of redevelopment going up, infill housing in older neighborhoods, they tend to see the prices come out and they're more expensive than what they feel they can afford. And there's a lot of items in the affordable housing plan about creating non-market affordable housing, but this upzoning proposal is really about market housing. And one of the common criticisms I hear is that it'll just create more homes at whatever price the market will bear, not necessarily something that can be accessed by people facing housing insecurity. So, what does RCG actually do to improve housing affordability in the city in terms of a broad upzoning?
Oh, let me jump in on this one. So first, the one I hear that often, and the thing that I always like to remind people is all new housing is more expensive than the housing it's replacing. Right. And so when you look at some of the stats that even Josh has been able to provide to us over the years, but even the ones that you'll see from like the real estate board, they show you that any new home, the cost escalations that we are actually seeing in the market are getting to such extreme points that if you were to buy a brand new infill home, brand new single infill home, it's like $1.6 million is the median price. And so when you're thinking about like, that's where the market's driving the single detached house is $1.6 million in and around. That's the median price. 50% or more, 50% or less. Mind blowing to me because I will never dream of a $1.6 million home that's mind blowing. When you look at an infill or a row house, the median price is around $585, right? And when you're looking at that difference, the key for me is actually when I go back historically to try and figure out what is the cost increase of each different housing form over time, right? And so this isn't about creating affordable housing tomorrow. This is about setting up our market so that we're not seeing these extreme swings to these unaffordable prices that will never exist for the everyday person because of the amount of money we make. so few people will ever have enough disposable income to afford a $1.6 million infill. And that is today's pricing. Inaction on any type of market housing is just going to see that continue to escalate and escalate and escalate. And so some of the background on what I'm describing is this. We've always had for varying forms of the row house type. The name row house is really just that 4 side by side, but we've had 2 in the front, 2 in the back in a variety of ways for a very long time. And if you look at any type of dense housing in Calgary and you track the cost escalations for dense housing in Calgary over, say, 40 years, you'll see a line that is much lower. Like you'll see it track steadily up because the cost of housing is going up, but it's not going up nearly at the same rate that single detached is going. And a lot of that is because of the scarcity, the extreme population demands, and of course the effort and the availability of the alternative housing now. So I want you to even consider this, like for like dense housing forms, so like the 4-pack, the 2 in the front, 2 in the back, the duplexes and so on, mind you, they're not at scale yet either. I think the amount of areas in the city that have duplexes is around 15 to 17%. And then the amount of areas that actually are zoned for everything else is around 20%. So that's apartment buildings and 4-packs, dense housing, all of that's like 20%. But like the cost increase for that type of housing is significantly slower than the single detached housing form. So when people think about this decision today, people always ask the question, they're like, flip the switch, we rezone the city, what's it going to do for us tomorrow? I always remind them, I'm like, I want you to imagine where we'd be today if we did this 20 years ago. Right? Because if we did this 20 years ago, the cost and the diversity of housing that was available to us would be so significantly different. And so if you're thinking, flip the switch, what's going to happen tomorrow? I think that's short-sighted. And I also think that someone's probably misinforming you about the impact of this decision. This is long-term city building vision about what would the city look like 20 years from now, knowing that we probably should have made this decision earlier. How does the evidence tell that story? Right? And so like, I look at dense housing right now. I live in what's called an MCG. It's a 4, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. And I've tracked the cost escalation on my own home since it was built in 1980. And there's a lot of reasons why we could break down land values and how it's sucked up into the cost of a home. We could talk about that for sure. But all I can say is my home is significantly closer to its original price than it would be than the neighboring single detached is to its original price. And for the most part, the scary part about Calgary is that because we've grown so much on the small edges of the city, like growing up, adding so much single detached stock year over year, imagine like how much downward pressure the fact that we've been continually building single detached housing for the last 30, 40 years, and it's still at an extreme price difference. And we've been adding single detached supply for a very long time. So when we talk about RCG, I always push back on anybody who says, how's this going to help us tomorrow? To be honest, this part of the housing strategy wasn't about tomorrow. This part of the housing strategy was about setting the stage for what happened in 20 years, because we can look back and see what happened 20 years ago and where it's brought us today.
I think some of the concerns are fair. Like if we're talking about housing affordability and then we create this program that comes up with these row houses that cost $5 or $6 or sometimes $700,000, I can understand why people don't really see the connection between that and affordability. But so I'm a middle class. I'm in a middle class household. You know, we're doing okay. We're not wealthy enough to live in these $1.6 million mansions. And I think one thing that's helpful is to look at the counterfactual. So if we rezone the city, we can start seeing some more of these row houses that are at an affordable price point for middle class families. If you look in neighborhoods that, unlike mine, only permit RC1 housing, there's a lot of redevelopment happening. You know, the old bungalow stock is turning over. None of that is affordable to anyone on a regular income. So, I mean, I sometimes refer to R1 zoning as mansion zoning because that's all that's being built under that zoning, and that's all. Like, you can fault developers, but they can't build little starter homes on those properties with land values the way they are. So they have to build those to make them pencil. So I think I agree with Councillor Walcott. It's not a perfect affordability solution that's going to make a difference tomorrow, but I think it's a desperately needed measure now for the long-term health of our city.
Yeah, and Kathryn, Courtney, you both touched on sort of that there's redevelopment happening. A lot of our housing stock has reached age, and if you are restricting only to R1, all you're getting is single replacement. So that does a couple things. One, the stock that's replacing it is very unaffordable, the most unaffordable form we have. It's also not adding any net supply to the system. It's just one house out, one house in. And so there's a couple of dimensions here with RCG is one, yeah, you're going to get housing turnover, but what are you enabling it to be replaced by? Semi-detached, you're adding net one unit, but even semi-detached is the median price for new semi-detached is $900,000, and you're only adding one unit. With smaller square feet with row, you're adding 3 net units plus possibly secondary suites on top of that. So there's an overall supply expansion that you get through enabling this type of redevelopment, which we know matching high demand against better supply will keep prices a little bit more in check, and you won't get that rapid escalation. But I want to talk about that middle price point, right? Because the housing strategy is just that. It's an entire housing strategy. Everything from the deeply subsidized, affordable, non-market housing all the way through the market continuum. It's not meant to, no single action is meant to solve the problems of the entire housing continuum, but the housing continuum works as a system. So we need solutions along that continuum. And one big gap in our market is, we hear about the missing middle, and a lot of planners talk about missing middle as if it's just related to form. It's just about the height or the scale, but it's also about where it fits in the marketplace. And we have this huge gulf right now in our market between apartment dwellings and single and semi-detached homes, and not a lot to fill that market space in between. So you end up having people staying, perhaps longer and not able to filter into another housing form, and that doesn't allow that apartment dwelling to be freed up for someone that might be looking for that unit as well. And so what RCG does is it introduces something at the middle of that price point. And that 585 median, yes, that's true today. But if we think about, given the policy, the regulatory risk of having to go through a rezoning, where are builders attracted to? They're attracted to the premium markets that are well tested for infill, that present the least market risk. And so that's going to be the West Hillhurst, that's going to be the Altadores of the world, the premium neighborhoods. So your medium price point sitting here. But as soon as you open up that opportunity for more of the city, where land values are lower, and the interesting thing about RCG is all the case studies are showing that 4 units is that inflection point, that the new units are about the same for 4 units, are about the same as the land input cost. So if you're paying $700,000 in Altadore for land now, your 4 row houses are going to be about $700,000. But if you're going to Bowness or Montgomery or Acadia, where land prices are maybe $485,000, your 4 units are going to be able to be closer to that level of affordability. So if we create more opportunity in the regulatory space, we expect that not only is the overall supply going to go up, which is going to help keep kind of rapid price escalation in check, the median price of the product itself with row house will start to go down as well. So that's why we think it fits very importantly into that housing continuum. So someone doesn't need to make the leap from a $350,000 apartment dwelling to an $800,000 row house. There's something for them to go into. And I'm the perfect example of that. That's exactly what happened with me. 10 years ago, moved from a apartment to a semi, because that was pushing my level of affordability as I started to have kids. If that row house form had been more available, that would have been an easier leap for me to make. And that's the situation that confronts a lot of households today, especially since single and semi-detached are so far out of reach of people's level of affordability.
So I'm glad you talked about the housing continuum and the middle market segment, because along with the comments you had about rental stock being added earlier, it leads into something interesting that I wanted to talk about. So this was a chart that I found in the CMHC's rental market report that they released in January. I'll put it up large screen for people watching on YouTube, and I'll have slides in the show notes if you're listening to the audio only version. But basically what this chart shows is vacancy rate over time broken up into rent quartiles, and this is for the city of Calgary. And you can see how vacancy rate changes with the most expensive rental units, the least expensive rental units, and the ones in the middle. And as you would expect, what we see with the most expensive rentals is that there's always more vacancy than the less expensive ones. It's more of a luxury market for people who have a lot to spend, so it's not as sensitive to changes in the overall market, and there's still some availability even when overall vacancy is low. Also, as you would expect, when vacancy rates are low, all of the less expensive units in the lower three quartiles are pretty much full. People are just trying to find any place they can afford to live, so they can't really be picky about what's available. However, what's really interesting to me about this data is what happens when vacancy rates are higher, because the middle two quartiles see some increase in vacancy, but you actually see a bigger increase in vacancy in the lowest quartile, the least expensive apartments. So to me, this gives a lot of credibility to the idea of a housing continuum where different segments of the market impact each other, right? Because you're not just moving around housing stock, you're moving around people within that housing stock. And so when people have more of a choice of where to live, they don't immediately go for the cheapest option. A lot of people decide to move up into those middle two quartiles, which alleviates pressure on the most affordable units. And we know also from the data that vacancy rates and rents are very closely related. And when vacancy rises, rents tend to stay stable or even decrease instead of having these out of control rent increases that we've been seeing for the past few years. In Calgary, actually, last year, it was a 14.3% increase in a single year because there was only a 1.4% vacancy rate for the purpose-built rental stock.
That's exactly right. I think, when people focus on, well, this is a middle of the housing spectrum in rents and prices, it's not going to solve the whole problem. But with the lack of it, it can cause problems cascading throughout the housing continuum. You get this phenomenon of upward filtering when there's scarcity, right? If there's no available supply in the middle of the market, well, those people with more incomes are just simply going to be able to outbid those on the lower end, right? And so that's what's accelerating gentrification, for instance, where people are moving into lower market neighborhoods, taking up that housing because there is no relief valve in the market in the middle for them to move to. And so, that ends up making that lower end housing supply more scarce. So the whole point of the housing strategy is that it's intentionally about the whole continuum and trying to create action and really heavily focused on abundant supply at each part of the housing continuum so that people can effectively flow within that system, that you don't get these choke points that end up cascading with really negative effects throughout the housing continuum. And the people that end up suffering most in that circumstances are the people with the least, of course, right? That's intuitive. And so, uh, if you just look at RCG as a solution in isolation, yeah, you could say, yeah, it's just solving this. It's not solving the whole housing continuum, but it is a really crucial one in a part of the market that tends to be absent.
To even take it a slight step further, when you're thinking about the different ways people build housing anyway, right, and the different parts of that housing strategy that will support the entire spectrum of housing with regards to the affordable side. Like when you think about the spectrum of housing, I know most people watching this will probably already realize is that this RCG conversation, if the spectrum is this, the RCG conversation is over here. Unless my camera's flipped and then it's over here. The idea is it's like the market side of the housing spectrum, it represents a large swath of the product that's available. But on the total spectrum of what should be included in a healthy balanced market of non-market and market housing, so affordable, subsidized, below market, and so on, it represents actually a very small part of the entire spectrum. So you have kind of two competing narratives that we have to balance within the whole housing strategy. One is that if the market is this, and we're supposed to have a healthy amount in every section of the housing spectrum, and yet when we look at the realistic market on the ground and we see that we actually are, most of our offerings are in the market side of things, figure out what are the restrictions, what are some of the challenges and how that historically impacted us. And so Calgary, for example, we don't build purpose-built rentals very often. Frankly, we actually ebb and flow frequently between a purpose-built rental market and a condo market, depending on our economy. When our economy is good, we've been building condos, and then when our economy was rough, we switched to purpose-built rentals, and that was almost primarily because the city and everything was driven toward just letting the market decide what the appropriate stock was at the time, versus the reality that we know to be true, which is the market will always ebb and flow. And so we will want to make sure that when those economies change for us, whether there's job losses or different industries take over in a city, or just frankly, just the cost of living gets crazy like it did over the last 4 years, that we have a healthy stock of all options available so that people can slide up and down versus competing for what little amount is available. When you take that and you combine it with the interprovincial population growth, when you think about someone coming from Toronto who was middle class Toronto, is sometimes can be like upper middle class Calgary, and all of a sudden they're coming here because they can help compete. They can compete in our market much more than they can compete in the market there. And the numbers are staggering about interprovincial migration, about how many people are coming to Alberta. Alberta is calling, people are answering, we're coming. And that's more and more people competing for what exists. And if we're not even going to enable more stock, then everybody is just competing for what's available. And people who are on the lowest quartile of affordability, I mean, the market's not their friend, which is why, of course, we have the rest of the strategy to help support rebalancing the market in that sense.
I'll just add a real world example. So around the corner from me, there is a fairly large RCG development. And they took down 3 bungalows, so 3 households, and they built 26 units. So 13 up, 13 down. And these are purpose-built rentals. And I've gotten to know some of the people that live in this complex. And, like these are not luxury townhouses, but they're quite nice. Like they're new and they're fresh and they're clean. And the people who live there are very, very grateful, because it is soul crushing to be looking for rental housing right now. And I think that for so long in Calgary, you might rent for a while and you might live in an apartment or a basement suite, but when it's time to, start your life or start a family, you buy a house. And that's just been the natural order of things. And I think with the price of real estate right now, that's becoming more and more difficult for people. And so I think we have to acknowledge that there will be people, people with good jobs, people with good incomes who are renting for longer than may have been the norm in Calgary. And I think it's important that there is high quality rental housing for them. And I think that housing needs to take different shapes. We can't all just put, not everyone wants to live in an apartment, although families can live in multifamily housing. But I think RCG housing is a really good middle ground for that. And it's family oriented, it's grade oriented. So I think it is really important to fill that gap.
I'll just add to couple points that I picked up on from some of your comments. And one is that, of course, non-market housing has to navigate the regulatory sphere as well, right? So the rules that we set up to enable market housing, if a non-market provider wants to provide family scale, say townhouses or row houses, they're also left to um, they're also left with a situation of scarcity in land if 80% of your land base is not available to the types of forms they're looking for to build for non-market housing as well. So I think, our Calgary Housing Company, our non-market housing provider, I think something like a third of their housing stock is townhouses, like that type of form that's, suitable to families with children and things like that. So these types of regulatory changes, not in and of themselves necessarily, but in combination with other proposals around parking and other type process improvements, also will significantly benefit those non-market providers at the lower end. But the other point I wanted to make was something Courtney touched on, which is sort of like the patterns of institutional investment in like large scale multifamily, right? So yeah, we go through these ebbs and flows where condo market's hot, you get a secondary rental market out of that, or condo market dies like it did in Calgary in its downturn, and then institutional investors, because you have not a lot of production happening, fill that gap with rental, purpose-built rental, but usually at the very large scale. What this does as well is it opens up different avenues of investment that aren't, pension fund back investors, for instance. It opens up totally different types of capital and labor to the market. So you get these smaller operators funded differently. Maybe they're funded through CMHC, maybe they're funded different ways. But you are able to smooth out some of those ebbs and flows by introducing new players into the market. You're lowering the barrier of entry to a lot of different types of players that just simply don't have the wherewithal or won't take the risk to go through a rezoning. They're used to operating, building single and semi-detached houses where they can go straight to development permit and build. And so you can draw from though, if you create the supply availability in land and you create a regulatory environment for those operators to operate, you're opening up totally new pools of capital that you would otherwise not have in the type of regulatory environment we have now.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit, what kind of timeline and cost concerns are there with rezoning for development to RCG currently? Because the zone does already exist. It's already in the regulations. It's just not the baseline. So people can apply for a rezoning, but what kind of impact does that have on timelines and cost?
So yeah, currently it takes about 9 or 10 months to go through our rezoning for an individual parcel. So obviously there's a time cost to that and a money cost to that to go through that type of process. Now council is approving the majority of these because I think they're ultimately seeing they're compatible and appropriate in these lower density contexts. But there's a lot of builder types that just you talk to them about having to go through a rezoning and they'll look at you like you have a third eye. They'll just be like, why would I do that? I'll just keep building semi-detached houses. So what we've heard a lot from the building industry is removing this sort of time and regulatory risk is really crucial to them. And if you think of that, like 9, 10 months, that's a significant amount of time. But if you think what's happened, in the period, say from 2022 to 2023, how much did interest rates rise during that 10-month period? That suddenly make projects seem feasible at the beginning, but by the end of it, based on that time delay, their carrying costs and their cost basis changing renders some of those projects less feasible. So we're very sensitive to ensuring that we have a process that is speedier and reduces that regulatory risk, and we see that as crucial, and we've heard from the building industry that that's crucial for them to participate more in the building of these types of housing.
Like, just to think about it in terms of numbers, like if you were to buy a standard lot, maybe just on some of the simplest things, right? Maybe the simplest things is you have a 9-month approval process just to get the rezoning before you would ever do anything like demolitions, before you do anything like grading the land, and then actually going through the period of construction, right? So let's say someone applies in January and they're looking toward September and they get their rezoning done. 9 months, so let's say they pay, just let's think about purely property taxes. 9 months, $3,000 per month. $3,000 a month from some of their properties that they're trying to negotiate and trying to figure out, and how that all adds up to their total costs in the end. And then you're looking at these carrying costs, the interest rates. Sorry, I said 3,000 because that's the total carrying cost. Think about the property taxes, their interest rates, the fact that they're no longer generating revenue from these properties. Like, oftentimes you'll see people won't be renting in them because they're trying to speed this process up. If they demolition prior to a rezoning, because they want to speed things up in that sense, that's another reason why they're not actually taking any money. Plus, they got to make their mortgage payments or in this case, their lending payments, their debt payments that they've taken out because they had to borrow money to actually purchase the land. So they're paying their debt, interest rates change, and so on. Let's say that over the course of 9 months, that adds up to, say, $35,000 to $40,000. I'm lowballing this based off of some of my conversations, but $35,000 to $40,000. Simply put, that's just them sitting on the land before they can start building. And that's going to come back in one way or another. So if it comes back in the form of the actual building itself, if it's one building, that's a significant number that's just added on to the cost of their interest. That continues, of course, the carrying cost continues throughout construction to the end product where they've got to find a way to recoup the carrying cost of redevelopment. And so all of a sudden, all of that time that's wasted just ends up being a part of the price of the home that you, as then a purchaser or a renter, are responsible for then paying, because that is the base cost of the home that gets transferred to you. You take out a mortgage to cover that carrying cost, and that interest that they've been paying on just gets transferred to you. So if it's $30,000 additional on the cost of a house, you as a purchaser, the home buyer, the renter, you are paying for that. It's the same conversation we have about parking spots. If you just think about the fact that you're buying the entire piece of land and you've carved out 15% of it for cement slabs and a garage, that's $50,000 to $75,000 right there that you are still paying for in your mortgage, in your interest rates. And so I know people like to think that this conversation is all about how does this help the developer, but I have to buy this home, right? And I always try to tell people, it's like, who does this benefit? I'm like, the families that live in this home, who maybe have $30,000 less on their mortgage over the course because we were able to expedite construction from a 2-year process to a total 9-month process, or sorry, to a 1-year process. That's significant. That's less money I have to borrow. That's less money that I have to pay interest on over the course of the term. Piece by piece, it all adds up.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think the data does show that over time, this increase in the base price of homes we've been seeing, part of it is because with all these regulatory costs and risks involved, developers want to squeeze every possible penny of profit they can out of a property. So you end up seeing inflation in, size and luxury finishes of these properties because it's really hard to turn a profit otherwise. And you do see that over time, the average size of a home has increased greatly. And I don't think it's because of what the market has been demanding. I think it's because of how the market is structured and what it takes to turn a profit.
Yeah, in scarcity, you have to chase margin then, right? And the other effect can be that, there's going to be a spectrum of sort of project viability, right? And there's going to be some percentage of projects that are right on the edge of viability, and the extra cost and time could push it over the edge. Yeah, you could respond by cutting and value engineering or something, which end up being maybe a lesser product, or you can go to a higher end market. But the other effect is there's just going to be a percentage of projects that just become infeasible, and that's going to reduce your overall supply, which is going to cause prices to jump, right? And so it's trying to create an environment where that development can flourish, right? And trying to lower as many barriers as possible, and that's where sort of a more healthy dynamic market dynamic can exist.
Now, this has been touched on a couple times, so we might as well bring it up. It's everyone's favorite subject, parking and traffic. So like it or not, most cities do tend to be fairly car-centric, and I think Calgary falls under that umbrella as well, at least currently. So parking is something a lot of people have reservations about when it comes to increasing density. So to what extent is this actually a problem, and how can we address it?
Kathryn, you want to speak?
Yeah, I was going to say, Kathryn, you want to dive in first?
How's
Oh, it's
parking
my
in your neighborhood?
favorite topic. It's my favorite topic. Parking in my neighborhood is fine. So occasionally we do get someone parking in front of our house, and we don't actually park our car on the street, so it doesn't bother me, and I don't own the street in front of my house, so it's fine. So one thing that I think is really important in this affordability conversation, and there's a great book from someone at the U of C called Noel Keogh called Sustainability Matters, and he talks a lot about how you can't look at transportation and housing costs in isolation, because where you live determines how you get around the city. And so I've always been very keen on living inner city because I lived without a car for a long time. And my family now has a car, but we share it with another household. So we're actually a 0.5 car family. And we are able to get around the city really, really easily with public transit, bicycles, walking. And that's the choice that we made in life. And I know that a lot of other households are interested in making that choice. So I get people's concerns about parking, but I think those are 20th century concerns. And Calgary has traditionally been a city of drivers, but I really do think that is changing. And I think sometimes by choice, but sometimes by necessity, we're getting to a point where a lot of households can't afford to have a home to live in and a car or 2 cars to get them around the city. And so they're being forced to choose between one or the other. There's really, really good data on parking and the relationship between parking and housing affordability, and also the data on the benefits of actually data that suggests that we dramatically overbuild or we overestimate the amount of parking that we need. And if we want to live in a city that is friendlier to other modes of transportation, we actually need to build less parking.
Yeah, this came up quite a bit. I mean, it comes up in every public hearing, in any individual application, but certainly it has come up during the discussion around the citywide rezoning. And there's a perception problem, like communities intensify, people park on the street, maybe someone's experienced, like some measure of congestion, right in front of their house in terms of street parking. But but there's also the reality of how much parking supply there actually is across almost the whole established area of the city. We have lanes with rear loaded garages. That's predominantly where we're seeing redevelopment happen. And I did a bit of a modeling of the community right beside me, an area called West Hillhurst, looking at I physically counted the off-street parking stalls, and whether it's single detached houses, semi or row. To date, basically almost every dwelling unit has 2 off-street parking spaces, and this is matched against a average per dwelling car amount of 1.7. So there is enough space off street for every car that exists in those communities. But of course, we know people like, for convenience and other reasons, maybe they're using their garage more for storage of their household stuff or they might have like an ATV or something that they're storing in there. People want on-street parking supply. But even with on-street parking supply, even if no one had a single garage, there's about the same amount of on-street parking availability. So we found that there was about 3.5 parking stalls per dwelling unit, compared to 1.7. So we had about double the parking supply compared to demand for parking within those areas. And areas closer to the inner city, around transit stations, around employment hubs, do have controlled on-street parking as well. So you can't, in most instances, just, if you work at the hospital, just park on the street nearby. We have controls for that. So I think it's more of an issue of how that parking is getting deployed, how many people are using their off-street spaces versus on-street spaces, perceptions of convenience. But I would garner to guess that there's probably at any given time, something like a 98% chance you could park within 25 meters of your house if you want to. There's acute little shortages maybe on a stretch of block, but overall our supply of parking is pretty strong. So I don't think it's a good reason to suggest that any sort of level of incremental intensification like this is a bridge too far because of an issue like parking.
I go a step further often, and gets me in trouble. Gets me right, but we end up having conversations about, like, I understand that I want to validate the experiences, the feelings, the perceptions, and the frustrations that come with not being able to park directly outside of your house when you've expected to be able to do so. Because when we set expectations, honestly, you're setting yourself up for long-term resentment anyway, because you believe that you own something, you believe you have a right to something because you've used it, versus the fact that it's actually the public street and someone else has every right to use it as well. That's a natural conflict that I see every single day, that I understand, I honor. I make jokes about it. So I live very close to a facility that welcomes a lot of seniors to party. And seniors drive a lot. So I randomly come home sometimes and there's like no parking, because I park on the street. There's no parking anywhere in my street, because the seniors have taken over, right? This area. And so when
it's a party.
It's a party. When they party, they go. And so when I see this, I park like 100 meters around the corner from like door to car is like maximum 100 meters. And there's a stretch of parking every time. And it's like, that was the level of inconvenience with extreme parking congestion for the area. Like, we're talking every open spot on a 2-block radius was like filled. And I could just sneak around the corner and I'm fine. And I remember the first time I had to do it, I had 2 feelings about it. I was conflicted because on one hand, I was like, so this is what it's like. I was like, now that I know. And then on the other hand, I was like, but I can it took me 47 seconds because I'm a slow walker to like get from my car to my front door. I was like, oh, that's not that bad. So there's that side of things. On the other side of things, where I'm much more data driven and arguably cold in this conversation is, I mean, whatever. When we're talking about these challenges of parking versus housing, I think about the fact that if I have to buy a home and you're telling me that because of the rules that a city has about $75,000 of 25 that's going to be gaining interest for 25 years is mandated because of a parking spot, that causes me more stress financially in the long term than having to walk 100 meters. Secondly, I know that as an ex-teacher, when I was teaching in high school, you talk to students will use transit, young people will use transit their entire life. If during that correct age, if during that time while they are in school, the transit is frequent and reliable, they will use it for their entire life. We can create a generation of people who do not care about their cars because we've created a transit system that is reliable. And then that's also the experience that I grew up with, because I grew up in Toronto and I knew like I didn't get a license until I was in my 20s because I was like, oh, I didn't need one. I never needed one because I could get around the city without any concerns or problems. It was habits I built and so on. And then lastly, the thing that drives me the most crazy in this conversation, and I'm passionate about it because I talk to people about this every day, is you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. It's it's a cliche now where I'm like, if there's any way that you could either carpool or figure out ways of getting around the city much more efficiently, traffic would significantly decrease, including street parking and congestion. Because you might think that look at all these cars in the neighborhood, I have nowhere to park. You're one of the cars that are in the neighborhood, and if every single person on your street thinks that way, of course we get into these conflicts. But transit will only ever get to the stage where it will solve this problem when we actually have enough people in a community to use it. And so I can't lose sight of those three things where I want to honor your experience because I see it, I know it, it's human. But I also know that the future is transit in a city where housing is affordable, because that's the only way for it to ever really work, knowing that housing costs is tied up in land.
But if you're a young person listening to this thinking of going into planning or civic politics, just be aware that a lot of your job will be thinking about parking.
I'll just jump in again. This is honestly one of my favorite topics. There is a great book called The High Cost of Free Parking. There's also a really, really good book called Paved Paradise that was published recently, but it will really change the way you think about parking. One thing that we can do is charge for street parking, and it is absolutely the right thing to do. It is a great tool for parking management, and is something that is done in virtually every other city in the world that has, cars. So I know that it has been a tough conversation in Calgary over the past year, but I really hope we get past that. And I hope we get to the point where we can just accept the fact that we should pay for street parking. And if we price it correctly, that can solve a lot of these problems.
So what about other infrastructure like water, sewer, gas, electricity, etc.? How does increased density affect strain on those systems, and how would we deal with any requirements for capacity increases?
Yeah, so a couple things here. This is an objection we hear a lot about, or concern we hear about is, do we have the infrastructure capacity to do this? So the first thing to say about that is that within our established area of the city, the built up area of the city, about 86% of communities are below what their peak populations were, right? So infrastructure was built for peak population, water, sewer, streets, community facilities, etc. And through the life cycle, just the way our city is built out, very typical life cycle, very quick population escalation to build out. Lots of children in households. Children move out. They're not typically staying in the same neighborhood. Population empties out, and so a lot of latent capacity in our infrastructure system to get back up to what the infrastructure was designed for in the first place. But we know there is growing communities. There's a lot of inner city areas that have regained their population and are past their peak again and continue to grow. So two strategies there. One is that, as we do, for example, life cycle replacement of infrastructure, like a water trunk or something. We're not just replacing, we're upgrading that capacity. And understanding where growth constraints are occurring, we're investing dollars proactively to upgrade that infrastructure. But there are also instances that are unforeseen. So sometimes developers might trigger an upgrade. The servicing analysis shows that development might trigger it. In the past, that 100% of that upgrade was borne on by the developer directly. It was their responsibility to do, which you can imagine would kill some projects. And so we've developed this tool. Basically, we're operating through a pilot now, fully funded by the city to start. But basically, um, the city will pay for those upgrades. But the long term plan is to create almost like an insurance levy tool. So everyone pays in a little bit of money, and if any given developer triggers an upgrade, we pool that money with city sources and we upgrade that infrastructure. So whoever happens to be first in that triggers that investment is not 100% on the hook for that today. So we have capacity latent in a lot of parts of the city, but where we are growing, we have proactive and reactive tools to address infrastructure.
So my husband and I used to live in a very small house in the same neighborhood, and we could barely fit the two of us in this house with all of our, I don't know, our musical instruments and our other things. And I met some people in front of our house one day, and they told me that they were former residents of the house, and they had had a family of 6 children living there. And, family sizes were so different back then. And our neighborhood is well below peak population. And I think when we talk about infrastructure, we can talk about sewer and water infrastructure and things like that, but we should also talk about the road infrastructure and the transit infrastructure that is like the costs associated with that are so high in a city as spread out as this. And if we can build our city in a way that is a bit more efficient, I'm sure that the cost savings of a more efficient transportation system will more than offset the upgrades necessary to build the houses that we need.
And it's the cost savings of to who, right? When I think so many people think about the idea of their quality of life is tied up in these particular bills. I have to have a car. Well, you don't have to have a car if we have this system. And even if it's more expensive, but you have a higher density, it's more efficient. And let's say we are traveling by transit versus car, you will save thousands of dollars every year in your overall quality of life and your overall bills that you'll pay every single year. And maybe, sure, let's go worst case scenario, because I get this all the time, is that my taxes will go up to make a better transit system. Okay, cool. Let's assume that that's the direction that we do it. You still now have an option to save a significant amount of money every year, and that's a choice that you now get that you might not have felt like you had when the bus was coming every 20, 30 minutes. I love the infrastructure conversation because I think that I also think, again, this is a very rational thing to consider. Right? People are like, how, if our community is X now with this many homes, how can the infrastructure support more? I love talking to people about the fact that it's never actually been about how many homes there are, but how many people are there. And then when they go through, they're like, well, what does that matter? And I'm like, well, I'd like to tell you about the toilet, because it's actually a conversation of how much is your home flushing the toilet, right? And that is either due to someone has some, we never judge people with IBS, but it's also because if you have a lot of people in your life in a house, you will be flushing the toilet frequently, right? And that toilet itself might be, for example, a 50-year toilet that's extremely inefficient, that uses 3 liters to flush a toilet at once, a full bucket load that you just throw down there, versus you get a new toilet that uses 1/10 of the amount of water. And so if there were 6 people in 1975 in a home and 6 people in 2014 in a brand new home, and you compare the amount of water that is used by both of them, it is significantly less now. And to Josh's point about latent capacity, not only are households getting smaller, efficient, or appliances are getting more efficient, and so you have less people using less water, so you can all of a sudden start thinking about it in a way, well, now we can add more homes, because if we have all these people using less water every single day, then the waste isn't going to be the problem.
Yeah.
And if we think about the way of how much water we're using individually, there's a lot of places where everyone needs to be a little bit more careful. How long do you leave your tap on when you're doing the dishes, brushing your teeth? That's a lifestyle thing, but it's not an infrastructure capacity problem. It's a lifestyle choice that we have to make in so much of our infrastructure. And that's the part that I love talking to people about, because if it stops at this idea that more housing equals a higher use of infrastructure, like waste and wastewater, if it stops there, sure, I understand your argument. But the reality is, it never stopped there. It didn't stop there 50 years ago when we built the infrastructure, 100 years ago when we built the infrastructure. It never stopped there. It was always about how much water is flowing through those pipes, and how do we determine how much water is flowing is based on those appliances, the uses, the flushes, and so on, and the population, all of the above. It's never really just about how many doors are on my street. I nerded out on
Toilets.
You're welcome.
Just take it a dark turn now.
Okay, so the last question I have, and this comes up pretty much every time in any kind of planning discussion, but it's about, the character of the neighborhood and how will these changes affect the character of people's neighborhoods that they live in now and that they may have lived in a long time. I see frequent objections to things like this because people say, I bought a single attached home in a single detached neighborhood, and they feel they should have the right to maintain that lifestyle going into the future because that's what they bought into when they bought it. Now, I have my own thoughts on this issue, but I will let you folks go first.
I can go first on this. So, the character of a neighborhood. I mean, so I grew up in a heritage house. I grew up in a different city, and I used to think that, heritage houses were the most important thing in the world and should be preserved at all costs. But I did grow up on a street that was actually quite diverse. So there was a nursing home on the street, and there was a 6-story apartment building on the street, and there were some other heritage houses, and there were some other houses that I would say didn't have a lot of character. And so I learned growing up that different types of housing can mix, and it's not the end of the world. But one thing that we hear quite a bit is that the character of a neighborhood is less about built form and more about the people in that neighborhood. And so we were intentional with the name of our organization. We're called More Neighbours Calgary because we are people-centered and we don't see a problem with welcoming more people into our communities. And so I live in a wonderful neighborhood, and I live in a neighborhood with a lot of original bungalows that frankly they're devoid of character. Like, they're not architectural marvels. My house is quite boring, but I live in a wonderful neighborhood because I have wonderful neighbors, and I've gotten to know a lot of them and formed bonds and relationships with them. I mentioned there's an RCG development around the corner from me. I've formed bonds with the people in those homes, and they've added to the character of our neighborhood. They haven't detracted from it in any way. As a community association volunteer, I have dealt with a lot of people's concerns over the years, and they are real. Change is really, really difficult for people, especially I think for people who've been in this neighborhood for a long time. And there are people, I know neighbors that they're living in the house that they grew up in. And so it's hard to watch the landscape change. It's hard to see homes torn down, but we have to press forward with housing people, and we have to look at the upside of it.
Yeah, I think any city building conversation is about trade-off discussions, right? I mean, we could have a perfect outcome of communities staying static, right? And that's an outcome we can choose, but we have to understand what the downside of that is. We're going to have more scarcity in housing than we would otherwise have if we thoughtfully allow and plan for the evolution of communities to change. Because I think change is going to happen whether we sort of plan for it or not. It can either sort of happen to us and we can react to it, or we can plan for it and be intentional about it. But I agree everything you said, Kathryn, about it being about people. People are the things that comprise the neighborhood, not just the built environment. But even if you're just talking about the built environment, there is whether you do an upzoning or change or not, there's a change in scale from old to new, right? And in the housing strategy, we talked a lot about neighborhoods that have a lot of scarcity. They're only for single detached houses. The old small square foot house gets replaced by a very big house, right? The change in scale is not as much about whether it goes to 1 to 4 units or 1 to 2 units or 1 to 1 units. The change is really old to new. And we have a choice to make whether that bigger structure houses more people or fewer people at a higher price. And we think amongst all available trade offs, allowing a few more people in housing forms that are very similar is, in homes that are more similar than they are different. If you look at their height and their massing, they're more similar than they are different. We're not dramatically changing the scale of the built environment around you, but in allowing more diversity, we're allowing more neighbors to be able to show up at price points that are a bit more affordable. And this proposal speaks to suggesting that those trade-offs are one's worth making. And if you're concerned about character, the community of character is going to change as housing stock turns over, but we can have other benefits if we allow a bit more diversity.
I've always approached this from a different perspective because of my background in anti-racism and understanding. I think a lot of people, when they think about our zoning bylaw and the way that neighborhoods are built, they view it from a sense of they view it from a sense of like, I want to, this is the life I wanted to choose. I've always viewed it very similar to homesteading, right? Like people are always trying to carve out the largest piece of land available to them. And for a very long time, the big push was toward that single detached area, the white picket fence narrative. But that's not, like, community character is not tied to the housing form in any particular way. And I've always believed that what it's tied to is that people make a certain degree of choices, that they've chosen to live in an area. And with exclusionary zoning, a lot of people think the opposite to exclusionary zoning is inclusionary zoning, but they're kind of misnomers in a way. Exclusionary zoning is exactly what it's supposed to sound like. It's about keeping people out. It's about excluding people from a certain ability to be here. And the opposite to exclusionary zoning has always been diversity of housing choice. But that diversity of housing choice matters for a long list of reasons. And so when I look back historically, zoning and housing typology being grouped together in a way that's homogenous has always been a way of excluding different people from across the socioeconomic spectrum, right? So if all of the homes in an area are at X price, that means you don't have anyone near you with a lower socioeconomic status. And so I've chosen to live in an area where there is a homogenous socioeconomic status. That's the basis of exclusionary zoning. And when you take that a step further backwards in time, those neighborhoods were often built on a North America level. So not specific Canada, not Calgary, North America level. Those neighborhoods were built almost immediately post World War II and immediately post the integration of schools, at which different people from diverse backgrounds, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, all of a sudden had the opportunity to live side by side. And you saw an influx of the suburban neighborhood. You saw an influx of exclusionary zoning laws. And you saw this influx of people choosing to live in neighborhoods where they got, by a simple price point and neighborhood type, they got to choose the type of neighbors they got to live around. I say that because that's where I think community character really is still to this day tied up in, not so much in the same area in which it's extrinsically racialized, but I do believe it is extrinsically class-based still. And so when people come to me in my emails, people have very little filter when they email me. And they often will share with me the almost abundant reality that the fear is people coming into their neighborhood from different socioeconomic price points. I chose to live in a neighborhood where everybody was able to purchase a home like I was able to purchase a home, and everyone chose to purchase the type of home that I chose to purchase. It's this vision that my community's character is tied up in this homogeneity. Everyone's the same. And because everyone's the same, everyone made the same choice. And the fact that every house looks the same is proof that everyone made the same choice. It doesn't even acknowledge the fact that people are different and will choose for different reasons. And if it's the only choice that was available, that's probably why they chose it. But I think it's like this fear of the other. And the built form is a way of controlling the other. So your community character, I believe Kathryn and Josh are completely right, is not tied up in what a house looks like. However, the people that are in your neighborhood, you can control the socioeconomic status of your neighbor by controlling the type of housing that can be built in your community. So you have control. And I see that every day in emails where they simply say that if there's rentals that come into a neighborhood, they start using words like ghetto. They start saying it's going to turn into a slum. They start saying those people. They start saying that this will be these people. They always say these people won't care about the community like we care about our community. And so some neighborhoods will often utilize the language of housing form. They'll say like, oh, the community character, the architecture, and so on. When I open my inbox, it is a fear of people who are, simply put, different. It is a fear of people, and that is something that you can enforce through zoning. If I want to keep someone out of my neighborhood, if I can control the pricing of the housing in my neighborhood, I get to control who my neighbors are. And that, for me, is really what community character has demonstrated itself to be about. When I look at my inbox, when I listen to what my constituents are telling me, and they tell me to listen to them, this is what they're saying. And fundamentally, I can't ever stand beside what they're saying, because I know the history behind it, and I think I can read between the lines well enough to know what that means now.
I just want to jump in on that, because I managed an inbox, again, within my community association, and I read a lot of emails like that too. And sometimes you didn't even have to read between the lines. Sometimes people say the quiet part out loud. And in particular, there was this consistent thread of anti-renter bias. Like I heard someone recently say, I'm concerned about this rental project. Like, I fear for the safety of my children. And I was like, who do you think's going to be moving? Like, can you unpack that a little bit? And these are shortcuts that we take, and it's a phenomenon that's been studied by psychologists. We all stereotype, we all do it, but I think we've let it slide for a long time, and that's why we have the types of neighborhoods that we have, and that's why we have actually quite a lot of class segregation in Calgary or among neighborhoods. Going back to my own personal experience, we live in a neighborhood with a high proportion of renters. I've gotten to know a lot of our neighbors who have been renters, and they have been wonderful people and wonderful neighbors, and there's no reason for them to be denied housing in any part of the city.
Yeah, and just to put my own perspective in there, I guess, I am a homeowner. I live in a primarily single detached neighborhood, but when I bought into that neighborhood, it was never my expectation that I would have some right or privilege over what other people are doing with their property around me. I didn't think I could exert control over the whole neighborhood. And I think that choosing to live in a city means that you will experience change one way or another. It's inevitable. And if my neighborhood is going to change, I would much rather see that change come in the form of an increase in density than an increase in homelessness or in financial stress or in the number of friends moving away because they can no longer afford to live there, or seniors on fixed income struggling to afford housing and groceries at the same time. I mean, I've seen all of that, and I think we're really trending in the wrong direction in that sense. Like one news story I saw out of Calgary as well was the Blues Can in Inglewood is going to be closing, or it seems like it's going to be closing now to make way for condos. Now, it's nice to see more housing being built, but if you actually look at the zoning map for that neighborhood, they're tearing down this basically beloved longstanding music venue to build multifamily housing, because that's one of the few parcels where they can do it. There is RC2 zoning on that same block, and so much of that neighborhood is zoned in an exclusionary way that you couldn't possibly build this housing anywhere else. So we're tearing down things that really contribute to the character of a neighborhood in a meaningful way because there's not enough space to build housing elsewhere. So to me, it's the change is going to happen whether you like it or not. The question is whether you're proactive in choosing what kind of change you want to see. With all that in mind, the vote is coming up on April 22nd. Are there any closing thoughts for our listeners from Calgary?
Just to participate. This, as you started, this is a issue that not only confronts Calgary but Canada, and it requires all our attention. A wartime-like effort across government, across private sector, but importantly, everyone in community to be participant in the conversations, to talk about, to discuss, to debate, to understand the choices that confront us, and contribute your voice to hopefully good choices that help us solve this housing crisis.
Yeah, so I'll just add that I think we actually have an enormous opportunity here, and I don't think we talk enough about the benefits that can come from this. So I've seen my neighborhood change over the last decade in really positive ways, and I think we have an opportunity to make a decision to move our city forward, to help our city change in ways that will be positive, that will allow more housing to be built, but that will also just create a more sustainable city, a more fiscally resilient city, a more climate resilient city, a city that can sustain a more functional transportation system, and that can just, make room for more people. So I actually see it as an amazing opportunity, and I'm looking forward to sharing my own story the week of April 22nd, and I encourage anyone else who is interested in these issues to get involved as well.
I'll always tell people to truly reflect and share their story. I think too often the conversation around these decision points has always been an attempt to separate them and isolate them into these singular moments away from the broader vision of a city. But if you think about your story and you think about the different people across your whole family, generations of people, whoever, and then think towards the next generations that are to come, the question will always come down to something very, very simple. Is, do you believe we should create a system in which people have a better opportunity to have a roof over their heads? And if it's a yes, then the housing strategy was looked at with that future in mind. And if it's no, ask, I want to know why. Because if the no towards what we're seeing here is coming up to parking, I promise you I have a solution for that. If the no is coming up because of infrastructure, I promise you we can have a conversation. It's not as bad as you think. If it's no because you want your community to stay the same, and I will admit we're going to healthfully have to agree to disagree, because I think the priority of this city will always have to be that for those who live here, we should have houses to put them in. And we don't have enough now, and we've got more people coming, and all of the attempts to confuse the issue, all it's going to do is actually just make it worse. And so think about your story, think about how you got here, and share it. Whether or not you want to share it at a public hearing or any other way, I think people need to tell their story more.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming and for sharing your thoughts today, and thanks to everyone for listening. And good luck with the vote next month.
Thank you, Mr. Moron.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.